understand the implications is one of Washington's best-known insiders, a master of the political game, Simon Rosenberg. Simon heads NDN and the New Policy Institute, a think tank here in Washington. He's frequently called on by major national media to offer political insights around elections and also broader U.S. political currents. A veteran of the 1992 Clinton campaign, I first met Simon during my own time in the White House, and he is truly one of the best political analysts there is. And in our conversation today, you're going to find out why. Simon, welcome to Democracy Dialogues.
It's great to be here.
You know, my first question is something that our audience might not really know why I'm asking you this, but it'll come clear pretty soon. What does it feel like to be named one of the 50 most powerful people in Washington by GQ magazine?
I think it was impressive to my wife for a couple days. But anyway, it's been, I feel lucky to have been able to stay in this game for this long. And, you know, obviously fighting for our democracy and making sure democracy prevails over authoritarianism here and around the world has really been a highly motivating thing for me in recent years. So it's great to be able to make a contribution.
You've been in the game for a long time. You've been at the top of the game for a long time. Let me just read a couple of the headlines that were prominent in U.S. media before the U.S. elections. This is from Dana Milbank's column today in the Washington Post. Yep. The bottom is dropping out of the 2022 elections for Democrats. Democrats on defense in blue states brace for a red wave in the House. Red tsunami watch. The Republican wave is building fast. And on and on. You get the point. Yeah. Simon, among all of Washington's pundit class, you called it right.
Yeah.
You saw that the red wave didn't materialize, and you, in fact, said that there actually was hope for Democrats not just to keep the Senate, but also to keep the House. What did you see that they didn't?
Yeah, I think, you know, as I make sense of what happened, I mean, here's my sort of the most important thing I can say is that since Dobbs ended, or Roe ended and the Dobbs decision in late June, we had indications that the electorate and the election had changed a lot, that this jarring event sort of created a very different election, highly motivated women, young women, Democrats to participate at higher levels. And so in all the measures of intensity, we saw Democrats spike. We did really well in these 5 House special elections, or sometimes called by-elections, right, depending on the country you're in. We did very well in Kansas, where there was a ballot initiative about abortion. Our candidates raised much more money than Republicans, which is another sign of intensity. And then also after June 24th, voter registration went way up for Democrats. And so we had and then Republicans, none of those things happened. They had problems raising money, their voter reg numbers went down, and they didn't perform well in these elections. And so there was a sense that we had that Democrats were going to bring it on election day, and Republicans weren't. And then the early vote happened in the United States, and the early vote confirmed this very high Democratic intensity, and Republicans struggled to turn out in the early vote. So we became convinced that this basic view we had of the election, that Democrats were much more motivated to vote than was conventional wisdom, the red wave, right, that everybody talked about, and that Republicans are actually struggling to participate, actually is what happened on election day. We did better than expectations.
For those who may not know the American system as well as you do, what is the early vote? What does that refer to?
So the early vote, yes, we have our political system is so different in so many ways from virtually every other democracy in the world.
We're always unique in everything.
Right, yeah. I mean, parliamentary democracy, no, right? You can go down the checklist. So we don't count votes on election day, a whole other crazy thing. So we have a system in the US now where people can vote early before election day for, in some cases, up to 3 weeks early, either by mail or in person or by putting the ballot into a special ballot box. So you know, now it's traditional that 30 to 40% of the election happens before election day. So we had a lot of data about how people were voting. And what was interesting is the media kind of ignored this data. And in another day, we could talk about why that is, but we were very focused on it because it was confirming our theory of the election. And we just didn't know. You know, I mean, I kept saying, the big question in this election was this Democratic intensity that we've seen going to show up in the election? And then it was actually showing up in the election. And so that's why I went into election day optimistic that Democrats were going to outperform expectations, and that's what's happened.
You referenced the reaction to the Dobbs decision on abortion in the United States, and that happened earlier in the summer, and there definitely was a huge uptick. A number of strategists thought that maybe that intensity wave had expired or was somehow being reduced before the elections.
They were wrong.
But you always saw that.
Yeah.
No, was it a result of polling or what got behind that gave you the confidence to make the calls you did?
I mean, to use an American term, I think there was a lot of gaslighting by Republicans. I think for Republicans, the conclusion of the election being that abortion, which is an issue that they are very ideological about. This is a very ideological debate here in the United States. But for the Republican Party to have the response after all these years, they finally got what they wanted on abortion, and then to have there be this sort of popular uprising against the extremism of this decision was something that they couldn't bear. It was something that they couldn't allow to become, because it would have meant that they were wrong and that they had caused this ideological fervor around abortion was causing the Republican Party to potentially lose an election. Well, how can that be, right? So I think there was an incredible effort to basically gaslight or to persuade people that what was happening wasn't happening. And the media, I think, bought into it. I also think there's been a lot of cases where male commentators were willing to believe things about women that weren't true.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and so I think that this idea that abortion wasn't driving the election was never true. And also one of the most remarkable results of this election, when commentators and people want to do analysis on this, there was an abortion ballot initiative in Michigan. And Michigan, the Republican Party was basically wiped out. I mean, we won the House and Senate. We won every statewide race. This was a state that, Biden won by 1 point. Our governor there won by 11 points, right? So the biggest wipeout, in some ways, the biggest story of this election is what happened in Michigan. The Republican Party has to be very, very worried about what this means for them in 2024 and beyond.
Neither President Biden nor former President Trump were on the ballot.
Right.
And yet both factored into the election. Tell us how and why.
It's a great question. I mean, I think for those of you, given the framework of these discussions, the most probably important thing I can say for this room is that extremism was defeated in the United States. MAGA had its third consecutive bad election. The new ideology of the Republican Party had its third consecutive disappointing election. They lost the House, the Senate, and the presidency in the last two elections. And in this election, with high inflation, Biden's approval rating being down, the traditional midterm dynamics, right? For us to have kept the Senate, this will be one of the best midterm performances by a party in American history. And even Donald Trump used the word disappointing yesterday to describe what happened. MAGA is a political loser for the Republican Party. And let's hope that what's happened in this election is that the grip of extremism has been loosened from the Republican Party. It would be great if we had a traditional center-right political party again in America. That would be I think that's our collective hope. I'm a Democrat, but I would like the party to look like Liz Cheney and Bill Kristol and Matthew Dowd and Michael Steele, as opposed to Steve Bannon and the extremists that have temporarily taken over the Republican Party. And so there's I think you're going to start to see prominent Republicans who fought against MAGA, like Liz Cheney, be strengthened and emboldened by the results. There's a lot of evidence that this extremism just isn't working politically and they need a different path. Let's hope that's what the conclusion is from Republicans as we move forward.
Let me ask you a question that's not fair because the answer is unknowable.
Yeah.
But ask you just to speculate. What do you think would have happened had Donald Trump stayed out of the news cycle and maybe announced for president later on, but didn't tease the issue, didn't insert himself into this news cycle? Would that have changed the results, or did that? What a lot of people have suggested, maybe that amped up the intensity, particularly for younger voters on the Democratic side for the turnout.
Listen, there are two things that he did in this election that was very damaging to Republicans. One was that he recruited and promoted these crazy candidates that made it far easier for us to win. And over the objections of the Republican Party itself and Mitch McConnell. I mean, he intervened in these Senate primaries with sort of election deniers and extremists. And that intervention was, in retrospect now, looking back, was very damaging for the Republicans. But the second thing, let's be honest, the reason why he became a factor in the election was all of his criminality and malevolence that were dominating the headlines. I mean, he did steal some of America's most extraordinary secrets, right? I mean, we can go through the list of things that he did, and that's what put him back into the media. And so he had to respond by then engaging the election because he became an issue.
Interesting.
It wasn't that he asserted himself, but he had to then manage this and not have it be only the negative stories about his criminality and his malevolence. And so that's what drew him back in, which was just basically the wheels of justice in America turning.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let me turn the spotlight a little bit onto the Democratic effort. There was another column in the Washington Post today that was calling the Democratic effort in some races Machiavellian, which was to say money was put into the campaign.
We tried to win?
Well, I want to hear your views.
Yeah.
But money was put into the races in some states to support the most extreme Republican candidates on the theory that turned out to be accurate, that in the general election against a more moderate Democrat, the Democrat would then win. Would you subscribe to doing that going forward? Is that a new strategy, or was that a one and done sort of thing, or is that a new element in American politics?
I think this has been a little bit overblown as an issue, only because all we did was provide voters with information, which is what an election is about. We didn't cheat or steal or lie, right? We just provided Republican voters with additional information, which is what every campaign does. So we stayed within the bounds of how you run elections in the United States. This was nothing that was illiberal or anti-democratic. And the information that we provided helped Republicans make a choice of who they were going to nominate. It was the person we wanted versus the person the Republican Party wanted, but that's how politics works.
Yeah, politics is a contact sport, isn't it?
It is.
We're here in the Democracy Dialogues with Simon Rosenberg, who among the entire punditry class in Washington called the U.S. midterm elections correctly. There may be one or two others, Simon, who got it relatively right, but based on your media interviews and calls for additional ones, of which I'm aware, goodness knows people are recognizing your good work on these issues.
Yeah.
Let's change the focus a little bit in terms of the context of the Hispanic vote. The Hispanic vote has been in play in the United States for a while. There were a lot of speculations that, in fact, the Hispanic vote might be determinative, at least in some states and in some races, and that it was going hard for the Republican Party this election cycle. Those prognostications really didn't turn out, at least in most cases. And we're going to talk about Florida in just a second. But tell us more about that issue.
I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this because, I introduced bilingual polling to the United States. I introduced Spanish language advertising to the Democratic Party 20 years ago. So I've been at the...
When you were 12 years old. So
I've been in ground zero around this battle over the Hispanic vote. So I have some long history on this issue. So here's where I think things stand, and I think it's really important. In 2004, when George Bush, the person who invented the modern strategy towards Hispanics were Republicans. It was George Bush in 2000, and the 2004 election were the first national elections in America where the Hispanic vote was big enough and important enough that there were major Spanish language campaigns. And it was Republicans who pioneered all this. Lionel Sosa, a very famous Republican media consultant, created this sort of modern space. And I was involved in countering that in the 2004 and 2002 elections. I worked closely with Bob Menendez and Ken Salazar, the current ambassador to Mexico, was actually my first partner in all of this work 20 years ago. And here's what's happened since 2004. In 2004, George Bush, the Democrats had a national margin of 700,000 votes of Latinos. In the last election, it was between 4.5 and 5.5 million, our net margin. So meaning that we gained 700,000 votes in 2004, but because of the growth of the population and our high margins, we now won 4.5 to 5.5 million more Hispanic votes than Republicans in the last election, depending on the data you use. In 2004, George Bush won Arizona, Nevada, Colorado, and New Mexico. In 2020, Joe Biden won those 4 states. It was the first time a Democrat had won those 4 states in 80 years. In 2004, Republicans controlled 5 of the 8 Senate seats in those 4 states. We now control all 8 of those Senate seats. Republicans had 14 out of 21 House seats. We now have 14 out of 23 House seats. So the gains that we made in the Southwest because of Hispanic voters were the reason we held the House and the Senate in 2002. We picked up 5 Senate seats during this time. We only had the Senate by 1. And we picked up 7 House seats and we only had the House by 5, right? Or whatever the number was, the final, whatever it is today. So our success, the Democratic Party's success with Hispanic voters, has been arguably the most important project of the Democratic Party in the last 20 years. And what you'll see now is the Southwest, we had the best showing in the Southwest that we've ever had in the last election. And if the election results that we're seeing coming in today have us winning Nevada and Arizona, we will have continued in our hold on this part of the country, what I call the Mexican-American part of the country, which is very distinct from Florida. Right? And among the Mexican-American part of the United States, you're seeing continued Republican erosion, continued growth of the Democratic Party in this part of the country.
So what explains, if I were on one of the networks and I were, saying, well, I can't let him get away with all of that. So
what's the counter?
Well, what explains the Republicans saying the Hispanics are going to us, the Rio Grande Valley, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, so the Rio Grande Valley went overwhelmingly Democratic in this election. So all of that may have been true, but it wasn't true this time. And if we had longer, I could get into sort of, what happened was the Republicans won one special election there, which we didn't even contest. And then all of a sudden the media narrative became Republican growth. And yet that Maya Flores, the sitting congresswoman who became the sort of famous, she lost her election by 8 to 10 points on Tuesday, right? So Democrats reclaimed a lot of the lost ground in the Rio Grande Valley, in part because Beto O'Rourke, ran an amazing campaign. Remember, Joe Biden only lost Texas by 5 points in 2020 without even spending any money there. So Texas, like these other states, is getting every 2 years is getting more and more Democratic, largely because of our large margins with a fast-growing part of the population, Hispanic voters. So, but the counter to our story is Florida. And there's been no question that the Democratic Party the Republicans have made enormous gains in recent elections with Hispanic voters in Florida. And those gains, along with a broader success they've had in what is the most important swing state in America, has made the most important swing state in America now very much a lean Republican state. And that's a big development. That's I don't want to discount that. It really matters, right? But it's also different from what we're seeing in other parts of the country. And we are agile enough as analysts, right, to be able to say, well, there's not just one trend here. The reason why I think that a lot of the media bought into the Hispanic going Republican narrative was we did have a dip in 2020 nationally, even though we did all really well. And the way I explain this is that we had a slightly smaller piece of a bigger pie. But when you have a slightly smaller piece of a bigger pie, you still have more pie. Right. And so our margins continued to be very strong in the Southwest, which is why we won. But the percentage went down a little bit. And my view is, and what I've been arguing, is that I think COVID was really disruptive to the Hispanic community in the United States. More Hispanics died and had got COVID and died due to COVID than any other part of the population. Hispanics in the United States are more likely to not have health insurance or access to the social safety net than any other part of the American population. Hispanics also had a higher percentage of Hispanics worked in jobs where they had to go to work and be in contact with people. And I think that the shutdown that happened hurt Hispanic families more than any other part of the United States. It was more disruptive. And I think that it caused a disruption in the traditional relationship of the Democratic Party. I think the shutdown argument made by Republicans that we were for shutdown and denying people the ability to make a living, and Republicans were for open and let people go back to work, I think that caused a big disruption in our traditional relationship with the Hispanic voter. It's not clear yet. We don't have enough data yet to know whether we've restored some of that and regain some of that lost ground. But I think we can, because I think we can. And I think what we're going to see is that, again, our strong performance of Latino voters, Hispanic voters was critical to us keeping the Senate and potentially, making the House much closer than anybody anticipated.
So if the COVID overhang really did impact the Hispanic community in that way, that could also be a contributor in terms of the Florida divergence. No, because Florida didn't shut down.
Florida didn't shut down. And if you watch DeSantis, the central argument DeSantis is making about himself is that he resisted the shutdown. He fought for the economic and social life of the people of Florida. And yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no question that whether that stuff is still relevant in 2024, whether it was even relevant in 2022, we could debate. I think all that is sort of past now that we're sort of getting back. But there is this lingering suspicion, I think, among Hispanic men in particular, who have to, make a living and feed their families. And how entrepreneurial the Hispanic community is in the United States, that there is a sense, I think, among Hispanic men in particular, that they're not really sure that Democrats are on their side any longer about making a living for their families. We have to address that. And I think we can. I think, Hispanic unemployment rate is the lowest that it's ever been. The uninsured rate is lower than it's ever been. The poverty rate in the United States is lower than it's ever been. We have a strong story to tell Hispanic voters in the United States. I don't know that they heard it over the last few months. And so we've got work to do here in that regard. But I think we can reclaim lost ground if we decide we want to.
And I assume another factor would be the composition of the Hispanic voter in Florida, as opposed to you referenced Mexican America. Florida is not so much Mexican, but Cuban, Central American, Venezuelan. Exactly. Therefore, the question would be, would you see that those issues would carry over into the general elections in 2024 based on the composition? I mean, maybe not the COVID issue, but certainly the makeup of the
I also think the attacks on Democrats for being socialists are far more resonant in South Florida than they are among Mexican Americans who, in Mexico, who's the current leader of the country, right? I mean,
that'll be for our next conversation.
Yeah, right. No, but I mean, I think it's important to recognize that the attacks on us as being socialists very resonant among Cubans and Venezuelans, far less resonant among people from Mexico and other parts of the world, of Latin America. I will say that one of my views about all this, and it's relevant for your work here, is that I'm beginning to believe the term Latino and Hispanic is becoming unimportant as a way of looking at voters, not in terms of heritage, but we're seeing such divergent electoral outcomes among that the Cubans and Venezuelans are not acting in any way like the rest of the Hispanic community in the United States, that if we can't get down to greater levels of specificity, I mean, we don't talk about European Americans in the United States, right? We talk about Irish, Germans. It could be we're at a point where this concept, at least in elections, of an Hispanic vote is become antiquated or anachronistic. It's the community's gotten too big. It's in each state. I mean, even the Hispanic vote in New Mexico is completely different than the Hispanic vote in Arizona, for example, right? So these kind of broad generalizations about the Hispanic vote, I think is no longer useful. I mean, we can be agile enough as analysts to look at what's happening in specific places. For example, the Puerto Rican vote is traditionally much more democratic than the Venezuelan and Cuban vote.
I'm really glad you've gone into that background, because you're exactly right. I mean, of course, we deal with these issues every day at the Council of the Americas. It's what we do. But for the broader population, just having that understanding, breaking it down, and what it might portend for the future, I think is really important. So thank you for going into that. Let's look further west. You teased out Nevada and Arizona. Both of those states are still in play. The calls have not been made at the Senate, and both of them will impact whether the Democrats hold the Senate or not. Both are heavily Hispanic states. How's the Hispanic vote playing in those particular states? Nevada's obviously also heavily unionized, but you had the issue there of COVID. People, they had to get to their jobs, but it plays differently.
Well, this is actually a really important question, is that one of the reasons Nevada has been so close, and we actually may win the Senate but lose the governor's race, is today that's what it looks like, and we'll see what happens, is that because Democrats were in charge during COVID. And so no state was hurt more by COVID than Nevada.
That's my question.
There's no question. And I know that from having been out there. I did the first Spanish language ads ever in Nevada. I've been working out there for 20 years. And the person running Senator Cortez Masto's race used to work for me. I was just out there a few weeks ago and spent time on the ground in Las Vegas. There's no question that what suppressed the Democratic brand in this election there was the attacks on us to shut down Democrats, and just the traumatic economic event that COVID was, far worse in Las Vegas and in Nevada than anywhere else in the country because tourism dried up. And there was no alternative. There wasn't a second thing to do, right? And so it was a traumatic event there. And so the trauma of COVID was far more acute and present in people's lives in Nevada than it was in virtually any other part of the country. And that's why you could end up having this result where Cortez Masto will prevail and the governor who was in charge of shutdown doesn't.
Yeah.
And so I think that the Culinary Union, which is the most powerful union there that represents many of the people that work in casinos and hotels, had its largest field organization that it's ever built in a midterm election. And it's one of the reasons we've always been confident that we were going to win there. And I think that the numbers this morning look very promising for us in both Nevada and Arizona. The Hispanic vote, I don't trust any of the data yet. I feel like that the polling is frankly
early.
so all over the place that I'm waiting. I'm going to wait a little bit because there's already people putting out crazy numbers about what happened in the Hispanic vote. The Republicans are desperately trying to claim that things are still really good for them with Hispanics. The evidence is that in places like, Colorado, for example, the Senate race and the governor's race weren't even competitive.
Not even competitive.
Gavin Newsom is likely to do even better in 2022 than he did in 2018. So you're seeing evidence of Democrats actually growing our margins in some of these heavily Hispanic states in the West, right? And certainly I think in Texas, we're going to find out that Beto O'Rourke, even though he didn't win, outperformed recent Democrats among the Hispanic vote, in part because of what happened with Uvalde and the mass shooting there, where I think Governor Abbott really misplayed that issue, and I think created a real opening for Democrats to reestablish this basic connection with Hispanic voters. And certainly the evidence today is that in the Rio Grande Valley, which the Republicans have been touting as an area of growth for them, it looks like we had a clean sweep there. So we'll see. We're going to know. I'm being very careful about my Hispanic analysis right now because I think there's been a lot of problems with data this cycle. And so I'm just going to be a little patient. But so far, it looks like everything held for us.
Yeah. Simon Rosenberg, in the 2 minutes that we have remaining, let's look to the future just a little bit. Some people have said that the race for the presidency in 2024 begins,
today.
Yesterday, the day after.
Unfortunately.
Exactly right. So you've got your work cut out.
Yeah.
But based on what we've been talking about the Hispanic vote, and 2 years is an eternity in politics. 2 days is an eternity in politics. We get that. But what would you be advising folks to be looking at in the context of the Hispanic vote as we look forward to, or look ahead to 2024?
The most important development is Republicans now think they can win with Hispanic voters. So they're trying much harder. That's really good.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's good for the country. It's good for Hispanics, right? It's, and I think it's a healthy thing. I actually think now, I think this has been a great development because I think it also helps the Republicans, it makes it harder for them to slip into a place of racial animus more broadly in the United States. And so I think this is a very welcome development that Republicans now are devoting resources and trying to compete. And it means for whoever our nominee is, whether Biden decides to run again or if it's somebody else, I think the competition over the Hispanic vote is now very much a central part of our politics. And I think that's great. I think it's healthy.
Would you go so far as to say it's the key swing vote in the country, or is that going too far?
I don't know if I would say that. I think that the real issue is Republicans have to break through the new blue wall of the Southwest. Our performance in the Southwest in the recent elections has utterly changed American politics. If they can't, as that population grows, our margins will continue to get bigger. If they can't reverse some of those gains, then an entire part of the country is going to be drifting away from the Republican Party, making their electoral college map narrower and narrower. And so there's an urgency for the Republicans to start to reverse these gains that we've had in the Mexican-American parts of the country. If they don't, it just makes it much harder for them to win national elections.
Yeah. Fascinating. I'd love to continue the conversation. We simply don't have time. I hope you'll come back at some point.
In these beautiful offices.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that plug. We appreciate that.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Democracy Dialogues. We've been talking to Democratic strategists, and the one person who got the call right in the U.S. midterm election, Simon Rosenberg, who I've known for many years, and I've been delighted to have the opportunity to have this conversation with. From Washington, this is Eric Farnsworth. We hope you'll join us again for the next Democracy Dialogues. Watch our website and information for that. Until then, have a terrific day.
Thanks, everyone.